Jake, a young black man, helped a wealthy Jew, but just 7 days later, the man made an unexpected decision that would change Jake's destiny forever. The bitter wind sliced through the cold, dark street, carrying with it the heavy scent of rain that was about to pour down. Jake stood at the corner of a narrow alley, watching Samuel's sleek black car disappear into the misty fog. His breath came out in sharp bursts, not just from the cold, but from the shock that was still rippling through his chest. It was like a slap across the face, a sudden realization that all the trust he had placed in the man he had helped so desperately was in vain. He had sacrificed his time, his safety, his entire being, to help Samuel. And in return, he was left standing alone, abandoned in the very alley where he had first met the man who had promised to change his life. 7 days. It had been just 7 days since Jake had risked everything for Samuel. The heavy city air filled his lungs as Jake gripped the keys in his hand tighter, his knuckles white. Samuel had been everything Jake wasn't: wealthy, powerful, influential, the kind of man whose life seemed to glimmer with ease. Jake, on the other hand, had grown up in a neighborhood where danger lurked on every corner, where opportunities were rare, and where people like him, black and poor, never got a fair chance. Jake had always dreamed of breaking free from the confines of his circumstances, and Samuel had seemed like the answer to those dreams. It all started when Samuel appeared out of nowhere 1 week ago, a man of sharp suits and a glint in his eye. He was in trouble, caught up in a high-stakes business deal gone wrong, and Jake had been in the right place at the right time. Samuel had needed help, and Jake had been there, ready to help him navigate the web of lies and danger that surrounded his business dealings. At first, Samuel had seemed genuine, even kind, acknowledging Jake's resourcefulness and offering him a real chance to work alongside him. Jake had done everything Samuel asked. He had helped arrange meetings with clients, brokered deals in dangerous corners of the city, and even stepped into risky situations to keep Samuel's name clean. Samuel's trust had given Jake hope that one day, all the work he was putting in would pay off. Maybe, just maybe, Jake thought, this was his shot at a better life. The pain of his past, the rejection, the hardship, he believed that Samuel could pull him out of it all. But now, just 7 days later, that hope had been shattered. "I don't need your help anymore," Samuel's voice had cut through the silence of the alley as coldly as the wind that stung Jake's face. "You can go now. Your work here is finished." Jake's heart stopped. The words echoed in his mind like a cruel taunt. Finished. That was it. After everything he'd done. After putting his own life at risk. After staying up late into the night, trying to prove his worth to a man who never really saw him for who he was, just a means to an end. Samuel didn't care about Jake, he was just another pawn in a game Jake had no part in. The rain began to fall in steady droplets, cold and heavy, but it was nothing compared to the weight on Jake's shoulders. His hands trembled as he held the keys to the car he had been entrusted with. Samuel had asked Jake to drive him that evening, but as soon as the business deal had collapsed, as soon as Samuel got what he wanted, Jake was discarded. Just like that. The tires screeched as Samuel's car sped off into the distance, disappearing into the night. Jake stood there, staring at the empty space where the car had once been, the emptiness echoing in his chest. His breath came out in ragged gasps as the truth settled in: Samuel had used him, just like everyone else. Jake wasn't even angry anymore. He was just tired. Tired of trying to prove his worth to people who didn't see him as human, tired of putting in all the effort only to be tossed aside when the job was done. The city around him felt distant, foreign, like it was made of shadows. The streets, usually bustling with life, were now eerily quiet, and the only sound was the distant hum of traffic. It wasn't just the cold that made Jake shiver, it was the realization that, once again, he had been left behind. He had believed in the promises, in the hope that someone like Samuel, someone who had everything, could see something in him, a kid from the wrong side of the tracks, struggling to make it out. But in the end, it was all an illusion. And the worst part? He had given everything for that illusion. As the first raindrops hit the ground, Jake let out a bitter laugh. This was the reality he knew. His skin, the color of the night itself, had never been enough to earn the respect he deserved. Samuel, with his golden opportunities, would never understand the struggles Jake had faced. Samuel had offered him a glimpse of something better, and Jake had foolishly believed it was within his grasp. But it wasn't. It had never been. Jake stood in the rain, his body numb, but his mind burning with the realization that he couldn't rely on anyone else. Not Samuel. Not anyone. His heart still ached with betrayal, but now, it was joined by something new, clarity. He had been wrong to place his hopes in Samuel, to believe that anyone would save him from the streets. If he was going to rise above the life he was born into, he would have to do it himself. And maybe, just maybe, this was the wake-up call he needed. As the rain poured down, soaking through his clothes, Jake lifted his head and wiped the wetness from his face. He wasn't broken. Not yet. He was still here, and he wasn't giving up. He could feel something stir inside him, a spark of defiance, of strength he hadn't recognized before. Jake wasn't done. Not yet. 7 days. It had only taken 7 days for Samuel to turn his back on him, but it was also enough time for Jake to learn what he truly needed to do. He had no use for anyone who couldn't see his worth. He would make it on his own, or not at all. But Samuel, that man who had turned away from him, would have no idea what was coming next. The days after Samuel had driven off into the night were some of the hardest Jake had ever faced. Every morning, when the first rays of sunlight crept through his window, there was a brief moment of hope, a flicker of warmth in his chest. But it quickly faded, replaced by the sinking weight of reality. He had helped Samuel, had believed that the work he put in would lead to something, an opportunity, a better life, but now, the only thing left was the bitter sting of betrayal. Jake didn't know what to do with himself. The little money he had saved up from the work he had done for Samuel didn't seem like enough to start over, especially with the looming threats of the life he had tried so hard to escape. He had grown up in a world where survival wasn't guaranteed, where every step was a battle, and people like him, young, black, and from the wrong side of town, didn't get second chances. This city had been built on people like him being invisible, disposable. And Samuel? Samuel had taken advantage of that. He had promised Jake the world, only to toss him aside like a forgotten tool when his usefulness had expired. Jake spent his days wandering the streets, avoiding the places he used to frequent, the people who might ask questions he didn't want to answer. The rain didn't help, falling relentlessly, matching the gloom in his mind. He didn't want to admit it, but he could feel the darkness closing in around him. The sense of rejection that had once burned in his chest now felt like a constant weight on his shoulders, pressing down with every step he took. But Jake couldn't stay there, stuck in the past. He had learned one thing from all of this: he couldn't afford to wait for someone else to give him a hand up. Samuel had made that clear. He had to save himself. There were moments when Jake would catch himself, staring into the distance, his mind consumed by thoughts of what had happened, what he had done for Samuel and how it had ended. The anger that he had felt the night Samuel left him, the helplessness that had overtaken him in the days after, were all still there, lurking beneath the surface. He was angry at himself for trusting Samuel, angry at Samuel for using him, and angry at the world for being so unfair. But none of that anger was going to help him now. He couldn't afford to let his emotions control him. There was a part of Jake that still wanted to go after Samuel, to confront him, to demand answers. But he knew deep down that it wouldn't change anything. Samuel wasn't going to care. Samuel had already proven that he didn't care. And chasing after him, hoping for some kind of closure, would only drag Jake deeper into the hole of self-pity and resentment. Instead, Jake focused on survival. He found small jobs around the city, odd jobs, nothing glamorous, but enough to pay his bills and keep him fed. He stayed away from the crowds, from the places where people like Samuel would gather, the places that made Jake feel small and insignificant. He didn't need the validation of people who saw him as nothing more than a tool to use. One night, Jake sat on a worn bench, overlooking the city skyline. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, reflecting the lights of the buildings. He stared at the distant horizon, lost in his thoughts. It was a cold night, and the chill in the air made him pull his jacket tighter around himself. The darkness felt suffocating, and for a moment, he let the loneliness wash over him. But then something shifted. There, in the stillness of the moment, Jake felt something stir inside him. It wasn't the anger, nor the pain, it was something else. It was a flicker of hope, a spark of realization. He was still here. He had made it through the worst of it. Despite everything, he was still standing. And if he was still standing, then maybe he had a chance. A chance at what? Jake didn't know. But he had to find it. He spent the next few days searching, not for Samuel or anything related to the life he had left behind, but for something else. He wasn't sure what, but something that would make him feel alive again. He walked the streets, visited old neighborhoods, and met with people who had also struggled and fought their way through the city's harsh realities. And through those encounters, he began to realize something: he wasn't alone in this fight. There were others, just like him, struggling to make something of themselves, to fight against the system that wanted to hold them down. Jake's perspective began to shift. It wasn't about Samuel anymore. It wasn't about being accepted into the world of the wealthy or the powerful. It was about surviving on his own terms, creating his own path, and not allowing anyone to define his worth. One afternoon, as Jake walked past a dilapidated building in the heart of the city, he overheard a conversation. Two men were arguing about something trivial, and for a split second, Jake felt that old, familiar sense of rage bubbling up inside him. He was about to keep walking when one of the men's voices caught his attention. "You think I care about your fancy suits and your business deals?" the man shouted. "You can't buy respect. You can't buy the street, man. That's something you gotta earn." Jake stopped in his tracks. The words hit him harder than he expected, resonating deep within him. They were words he had heard before, but never quite in this way. They were raw, real. They spoke to something he had forgotten about himself: his ability to fight, to earn, to demand respect. As Jake continued walking, he realized that he had been so focused on Samuel, on the idea of needing someone else to help him, that he had forgotten his own strength. The strength that had kept him alive through all the years of hardship, the strength that had driven him to work hard for nothing, to survive the rejection and humiliation. For the first time in days, Jake felt the stirrings of a new kind of resolve. He wasn't done yet. And he wouldn't let someone like Samuel, someone who had taken everything from him, define him. A week had passed since Jake made the decision to start over, to focus on his own survival, and to put Samuel behind him. His life felt like a fragile string, tied together by small moments of clarity that occasionally broke through the fog of pain and disappointment. Every day was a fight. But the more Jake forced himself to get up, to work those odd jobs, to keep his head down and move forward, the more he realized how little he truly knew about himself. His anger, his self-doubt, and even his hope, everything was wrapped in layers of confusion. It was hard to know who he truly was anymore, especially after all that had happened with Samuel. But just when Jake thought he could finally breathe and live for himself, his past came knocking again. It was late one evening when Jake was sitting in his small, dimly lit apartment, scrubbing his hands after finishing up a menial job for a local shop owner. His fingers were sore from the work, but the exhaustion felt strangely familiar, comforting. He could deal with exhaustion. It was the loneliness that gnawed at him, the quiet emptiness that lingered long after the work was done. His phone buzzed. The familiar name on the screen caused his stomach to tighten. It was Samuel. Jake hesitated before answering. The pain of betrayal had been raw in the beginning, but now, it had become something colder, more distant. Jake had learned to keep his guard up, to distance himself from the past. But Samuel was persistent, and after what happened, Jake couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. What could he possibly want now? Jake, Samuel's voice came through the phone, smooth and calm, but there was something unsettling about the tone. I need to see you. There's something you need to know. Jake's heart raced, but he kept his voice steady. I don't know what you think you can say to make things right, Samuel. You made your decision. You told me it was over. I know, Samuel's voice softened. And I know I hurt you. I'm sorry for that. But this is important. I need your help again. Jake's pulse quickened. He felt the familiar surge of anger rise, but it was quickly followed by a knot in his stomach. Was Samuel playing some game? Did he really believe Jake was stupid enough to fall for it again? I'm done helping you, Jake said, his voice firm, though his hands trembled slightly. Whatever you need, find someone else to do it. There was a long pause on the other end. Jake could almost hear Samuel weighing his options. He wasn't going to give up this easily. After everything Jake had done for him, Samuel wasn't about to let go without trying one last time. Jake, Samuel finally said, his voice tinged with desperation. I need you to trust me. I'm in trouble, deep trouble. I've made some enemies. And I can't get out of this on my own. You're the only one who can help me now. Jake closed his eyes, his mind racing. This was the moment where he had to decide once and for all, was he going to let himself be pulled back into Samuel's world? Or was he going to stand firm in the resolve he had built over the past week? The betrayal stung like salt in an open wound. Samuel had cast him aside without a second thought, and now, a week later, he was asking for help? Jake could feel his anger bubbling up, but there was something else too, something deeper, something that still lingered from when he had first met Samuel. Jake swallowed hard. He knew what he had to do. He had learned that he couldn't keep holding onto the past, that he couldn't keep giving people like Samuel the power to determine his future. But what if this time, just this once, it was different? What if Samuel was really in danger? What if Jake could finally be the one to make a difference? I'll meet you, Jake said, his voice colder than before. But this is the last time. And if you think for 1 second I'm going to help you for anything other than what's right, you're wrong. There was a long silence before Samuel responded. I understand. I'll send you the details. Please, Jake. I know I don't deserve your help, but I need it more than you can imagine. Jake hung up the phone without saying another word. His mind was swirling with questions. Was this just another lie? Was Samuel truly in trouble, or was he just playing on Jake's empathy once again? The next morning, Jake received the details in a brief message. It was simple, a location, an address. Nothing more. His stomach churned as he stared at the screen. It was a seedy part of town, the kind of place Jake knew well, but he hadn't been there in a while. He knew what he was walking into. This wasn't about helping someone anymore. It was about something darker. Something Jake wasn't ready to face. But he was already too far in, and he knew deep down that if Samuel had really put him in danger, it was his own fault for trusting him in the first place. Jake grabbed his jacket, checking his reflection in the cracked mirror before heading out. His heart hammered in his chest as he made his way toward the meeting point. It was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of the city seemed distant as he walked deeper into the alley where Samuel had told him to meet. Then, there it was, the figure standing under a flickering street lamp. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he realized it wasn't Samuel at all. It was someone else entirely. Someone Jake had never expected to see. The figure stepped forward, and Jake's stomach dropped when he saw the familiar face, one he hadn't seen in over a year. It was the man who had once been Samuel's business partner, the same man who had betrayed Jake during the deal. The man who had set him up. The man who had tried to destroy him. Jake froze, his body stiffening as the figure stepped closer under the flickering light. The man, whose sharp eyes gleamed with a mixture of recognition and mockery, was the last person Jake ever expected to see again. It was Marcus, Samuel's former business partner, the same man who had betrayed Jake when things had gotten ugly between him and Samuel. Jake's pulse quickened as the memories of that betrayal came flooding back, the sense of being manipulated and thrown away, the promises that were never fulfilled. Samuel had made it clear he didn't care about Jake, but Marcus, he was a different kind of danger. "What are you doing here?" Jake's voice came out low, but firm, as he tried to steady himself. His body was tense, every muscle screaming to either fight or run, but he knew that running wasn't an option. He had already walked too far into this mess. Marcus stepped closer, the street light above casting long shadows across his face. A smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "I thought you'd recognize me, Jake. But then again, you've been too busy trying to forget, haven't you?" Jake's mind raced. This wasn't how he'd imagined the meeting going. Samuel was supposed to be here, not Marcus. But if Samuel wasn't here, it meant one thing: Samuel had used him again. "I'm done with your games," Jake spat, his fists clenching at his sides. "I'm done with all of it. You two used me, and I'm not going to let you pull me back into whatever scheme you've got going now." Marcus chuckled, the sound grating on Jake's nerves. "Oh, Jake, you're still thinking too small. This isn't about Samuel anymore. This is about you, my friend. You're a pawn in something much bigger than you can even imagine." Jake felt his stomach drop, the weight of the words pressing down on him. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Marcus took a step closer, his eyes scanning the alley like a predator sizing up its prey. "You see, Jake, it's not just about money, and it's not just about Samuel's little empire. This is about power, control, and who gets to hold the strings. And guess what? You're one of those strings." Jake's heart raced as he tried to process what Marcus was saying. "You've lost me," Jake said, his voice more controlled now. "I don't care about your power games or whatever you're scheming." Marcus shook his head slowly, almost pitying Jake. "Of course you don't. You're too busy focusing on the past, on the way Samuel hurt you, to see the bigger picture. But you need to understand something. You were never just a helper. You were always a tool. And now you're in too deep to back out." Jake's chest tightened, the weight of Marcus's words sinking in. He had always known that Samuel and his business dealings weren't entirely on the up and up, but hearing it from Marcus, it was a cold slap of reality. Samuel had never seen Jake as a person. To him, Jake had been nothing more than a means to an end. And now Marcus was telling him that he was nothing more than another pawn in a much darker game. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake demanded, his voice rising. "What's the point?" The smirk on Marcus's face deepened as he stepped back, his posture casual. "The point, Jake, is that I'm here to offer you a choice. You can keep fighting against this, keep pretending like you have some moral high ground, or you can join us. We're building something here, and we could use someone like you. A man with your skills." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind, but the anger was starting to boil up inside him again. The idea of joining Marcus, of being pulled back into that world of manipulation and lies, made his blood run cold. There was no way he would let himself fall into that trap. Not again. "I'm not your pawn," Jake said, his voice unwavering. "And I'm definitely not joining you. So if this is some kind of threat, you can forget it." Marcus laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "Oh, it's not a threat, Jake. It's an offer. But I can see you're too proud for that. Fine. Stay in your little world, with your pride and your anger. But mark my words, you won't be able to outrun us forever. We'll always find a way back to you." Jake felt the weight of those words hanging in the air like a storm about to break. He knew Marcus was dangerous, that he didn't play by the rules, but he also knew that Jake had the power to control his own fate. Or at least, he thought he did. "I'm done with you," Jake said, turning his back and walking away. He didn't look back, even as he heard Marcus's mocking laughter echo behind him. The next few days were a blur of confusion and dread. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was closing in around him. He tried to push the encounter with Marcus out of his mind, to focus on his work and moving forward, but it was impossible. The world felt smaller now. The more Jake thought about what Marcus had said, the more unsettling it became. He had always known that Samuel's world wasn't clean, but Marcus's words lingered, eating away at his confidence. Could he truly outrun them? Could he keep pretending like he didn't have a target on his back? Then, on the 7th day after his encounter with Marcus, Jake received a package. There was no return address, no note attached, just a small, unmarked box. His fingers trembled as he opened it, heart pounding in his chest. Inside the box was a letter, simple and direct. "We're not done with you. Yet?" Jake's stomach churned. This wasn't over. He hadn't just been a pawn, he had been marked. And it was clear now that the game was far from finished. Jake couldn't sleep that night. The words Marcus had spoken haunted him, echoing like a broken record in his mind. "We're not done with you. Yet?" It was a threat, a warning wrapped in a cold finality that Jake couldn't ignore. He had hoped, deep down, that his involvement with Samuel and his world was behind him. But now, it felt like the past had only been biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The days passed slowly after receiving the ominous message. Jake went through the motions of life, working, eating, staying out of trouble, but nothing felt the same. Every corner he turned, every shadow he walked past, his senses heightened, expecting something to happen. His mind raced, torn between what he had learned in the past and the decisions he needed to make now. Could he escape this world entirely, or was he forever entangled in its webs? Then, the unexpected came. Another knock on his door. It was the kind of knock that sent a chill down his spine, a knock he had been dreading for days, knowing it was only a matter of time before they came for him. Jake opened the door to find a figure standing in the dim hallway outside. At first, he didn't recognize her. She was dressed in dark clothing, her face obscured by the hood of her jacket. But there was something about the way she stood, a confidence in her posture that made Jake take a step back. "Who are you?" Jake asked, voice cautious, his hand hovering near the door, ready to close it if necessary. "I think you know who I am," she said softly, her voice laced with a sharp edge. She lowered her hood, revealing a familiar face. It was one he hadn't expected to see, Leah, Samuel's sister. Jake's breath caught in his chest. He had met Leah only once, but he remembered her clearly. She was colder than her brother, more calculating, and far more dangerous. Jake hadn't thought about her much after Samuel had cut him off, but now, seeing her standing there, everything he had tried to forget came rushing back. "What do you want?" Jake asked, trying to steady his breathing. His stomach churned as he realized just how deep this whole situation had become. He was no longer just a bystander. His life was spiraling into something darker than he had ever imagined. Leah looked at him, her eyes assessing him as though she were evaluating a piece of merchandise. "I'm here to offer you a choice, Jake," she said, her voice low and smooth. "You've been given the chance to walk away, to live a quiet life, but you know as well as I do that won't happen. Not when you've already been marked. Not when they're coming for you." Jake's heart raced. "Who's coming for me?" he asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew the answer. Leah took a step forward, her gaze unblinking. "You still think you can escape, don't you? That you can just disappear and leave all of this behind. But you're wrong. You're too deep now. They've already set their sights on you." Jake clenched his fists, trying to control his anger. "What do you want from me? Another game? Another lie?" Leah sighed, almost as if she were disappointed in him. "You've never been good at seeing the bigger picture, have you? This isn't a game, Jake. This is survival. And you're going to have to make a choice. You can either join us, and we can help you get out of this mess, or you can keep fighting it, and you won't survive." Jake's pulse raced, his mind spinning with the weight of her words. He had already made a promise to himself that he would never return to that world, the world of deceit, power, and manipulation. But Leah's words were tempting, almost irresistible. He had been living in constant fear, every day wondering when they would come for him, wondering when the past would come crashing down on him again. "Join you?" Jake repeated, his voice filled with disbelief. "After everything that's happened? After what you did to me? You really think I'd work with people like you?" Leah's expression didn't change. "It's not about what happened in the past, Jake. It's about the future. You're smart. You've got potential. You've been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, but you still have a choice. You can walk away from all of this, or you can be a part of something much bigger than yourself." Jake's stomach churned as the weight of her offer settled in. The temptation to return to that world, to be part of something that promised power and control, was strong. But deep down, he knew what that would cost him. It would cost him everything, his dignity, his sense of self, and the only thing that had kept him grounded, his belief in his own worth. "I'll never be part of this," Jake said, his voice firmer now, the anger rising in his chest. "You and your brother, you're the reason I'm in this mess. I'll never join you." Leah's face softened, just for a moment, before her eyes hardened once more. "I thought you'd say that," she murmured, almost to herself. "It's a shame, really. But it's your choice, Jake. Just remember, you can't run from this forever. You can't hide from the truth." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as suddenly as she had arrived. Jake stood in the doorway, his mind spinning, the adrenaline still pumping through his veins. He had made his choice, he had turned his back on the life Samuel and Leah were offering him. But even as he closed the door, he knew the hardest part was still to come. The next morning, as Jake prepared to leave his apartment for work, he received another message. It was from Samuel. Jake opened the text cautiously, unsure of what to expect. But the words he read made his blood run cold. "You've made a big mistake, Jake. We will find you. And this time, there's no going back." Jake's chest tightened as he realized the full weight of his decision. He had chosen to walk away, but that choice had made him a target. He had burned every bridge, and now, the only thing left to do was survive. The days that followed Leah's visit were a blur of uncertainty, anxiety, and tension. Jake's world had become a series of calculations. Every move he made, every corner he turned, every step he took, he expected someone to be there, waiting for him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of being hunted. The message Samuel had sent haunted him: "We will find you. And this time, there's no going back." But Jake had made up his mind. He wasn't going back to the world that had tried to break him, the world that had shown him nothing but betrayal, power games, and manipulation. He couldn't, no matter how tempting Leah's offer had been, no matter how strong the pull of the life Samuel and Marcus had promised. He had one last thing to do. He had to leave everything behind. The apartment, the city, the life he had built, it all had to go. For once, Jake was going to take control of his fate. With a backpack packed with the essentials, Jake made his way to the bus station, his heart racing with each step. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this would be his final escape, that once he left, there would be no going back. But that was the price he had to pay for freedom. He had to walk away, no matter the consequences. As he approached the station, the sound of rushing cars, the scent of exhaust in the air, the hustle of people coming and going, it all felt distant, like he was moving through a dream. Jake took a deep breath and stood at the ticket counter, waiting for the attendant to finish processing his ticket. "Where to?" the attendant asked, not bothering to look up from her computer. Jake hesitated for a moment. "Somewhere far," he said quietly. "Anywhere." The attendant gave him a strange look, but didn't ask further questions. She handed him his ticket with a smile, and Jake turned to head toward the platform. His pulse quickened as the bus to the unknown approached. He didn't know where it would take him, but it didn't matter. He was leaving, and that was all that mattered. He stepped onto the bus, found his seat, and settled in for what he hoped would be the start of a new life. As the engine roared to life, Jake looked out the window one last time, at the city he had come to hate, the place that had been both his home and his prison. But just as the bus pulled away, something caught Jake's eye. In the distance, standing at the edge of the station, was a figure. A tall man. A familiar face. It was Samuel. Jake's heart stopped. How had Samuel found him? He couldn't have known about the bus, could he? The bus began to pick up speed, but Jake couldn't tear his eyes away from Samuel's figure, watching him like a hawk from afar. He didn't make a move, didn't wave or shout. But his presence was enough to send a chill down Jake's spine. Samuel was still watching, still in control, still playing the game. The knot in Jake's stomach tightened. "It's not over," he thought. "I'll never be free." Later that night, when the bus had reached a small town on the outskirts of the city, Jake stepped off, exhausted and emotionally drained. The journey had taken its toll. He felt drained, not just physically but mentally. He had escaped the city, but he couldn't escape the thought of Samuel's eyes, locked onto him. He couldn't escape the weight of the past that still clung to him, even in the middle of nowhere. He found a small motel on the edge of town, a place that looked forgotten by time. There was no luxury, no comfort, just a bed and four walls. But that was enough for now. He needed to rest, to think, to gather his strength for whatever came next. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of Samuel and Leah and everything he had left behind. What if he was wrong? What if they weren't finished with him, after all? What if there was no escaping this dark world that had tried to swallow him whole? As he drifted off to sleep, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he reached for it, half expecting it to be from Marcus, from Leah, or even Samuel. But the message wasn't from them. It was from someone he hadn't heard from in days. Someone who had been there from the very beginning. "Jake, I know what you're trying to do. But it's not over. Don't run. Don't hide. It's all part of the plan." The message was signed with one word, L. Jake sat up in bed, the phone shaking in his hand. L? Who was L? The message didn't make sense. Who knew what he was trying to do? He hadn't told anyone about his plans. He hadn't confided in anyone about leaving. So how could they know? And then, it hit him. Leah. The mysterious message, the cryptic tone, it was her. She had known all along. She had been playing him from the start. Jake's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The plan had never been his own. The decision to run, to leave it all behind, it was all a trap. Leah had orchestrated everything. She had pushed him to the edge, made him think he could escape, only to trap him in a corner where he had nowhere to go. The realization was like a punch to the gut. Jake had been played again. And now, he was caught in a game with no way out. But then, something shifted inside him. A spark of clarity. He wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. He wasn't going to let them control his life any longer. Jake stood up, grabbed his things, and walked out of the motel room. He wasn't going to run anymore. He was going to confront them. He was going to take back what they had stolen from him. He didn't know how he would do it yet. He didn't know what the next move would be. But one thing was certain, this was the end of the game. And he was done being anyone's pawn. Jake had always considered himself a survivor. But now, after everything he'd been through, he understood that survival wasn't just about escaping danger, it was about knowing when to let go and when to fight back. And this moment, standing on the edge of uncertainty, was the time to fight. As he walked out of the motel room, the cool night air hit his face, a reminder that the world was still moving forward, whether he was ready or not. His hands trembled as he clutched his phone, the cryptic message from Leah still fresh in his mind. He couldn't shake the realization that he'd been manipulated from the very beginning, that Leah had orchestrated this entire journey, pushing him into a corner, making him feel powerless, only to trap him again. He walked down the dark street, his steps firm despite the chaos in his mind. Jake wasn't the same boy who had first met Samuel and Leah a week ago. He had changed, and more than that, he had learned something that would set him free. His worth was never defined by the people who had tried to break him. It was his to own, and nobody, not even Leah, could take that from him. Jake paused in the middle of the street, standing beneath the harsh light of a street lamp. He knew what he had to do. This was the moment where everything changed. No more running. No more hiding. He was done being a pawn in someone else's game. He pulled up his contacts and sent a text to the one person who could help him now, Marcus. It wasn't easy to trust him, but Jake knew there was no other choice. The text was simple. I'm done running. I'm taking them down. You in? There was no immediate response, and for a moment, Jake questioned whether Marcus would even reply. But then, just as he was about to lose hope, his phone buzzed. The response was short but unmistakable. I'll be there. Meet me at the docks. The docks. Of course. Jake should have known that's where everything would go down. It had always been the place where deals were made, where the real power players came to settle scores. It was where Samuel and Leah had always been in control. And now, it was where Jake would take back control of his own fate. The journey to the docks felt like it took a lifetime, every step bringing him closer to the truth. He couldn't afford to doubt himself now. Leah's manipulation had been a carefully crafted illusion, a game designed to make him question his own choices. But he had woken up to the reality. It was time for him to end the game, on his own terms. When he arrived at the docks, the shadows seemed to stretch out like claws, pulling at him, tempting him to turn back. But Jake's resolve was unwavering. He walked toward the small warehouse where he had agreed to meet Marcus. As he stepped inside, the dim light illuminated the figure standing in the corner. Marcus, his face unreadable, nodded at Jake. "You're here," Marcus said, his voice low, like he was expecting a different outcome. I didn't think you'd actually show up. Jake took a deep breath, stepping forward. You were right. I was running. But not anymore. We're ending this, Marcus. The two men stood there for a moment, the weight of what was about to happen hanging heavily between them. But then, from the darkness, another figure emerged, Leah. Jake's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment. Her face was unreadable, but the glint in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't over yet. You really thought you could escape, Jake? Leah's voice was smooth, almost mocking, as she stepped further into the light. You think you can just walk away from everything you've been a part of? You think you can just tear down everything we've built? Jake squared his shoulders, his voice steady despite the anger that bubbled beneath the surface. I don't need your world, Leah. I never did. I don't need your lies, your manipulation. I'm done being your pawn. Leah chuckled, as if Jake's words were nothing more than a child's tantrum. You think you can just walk away? You think you can stand against us? She looked at Marcus, then back at Jake. You have no idea who you're dealing with. But Jake wasn't afraid. Not anymore. No, he said, his voice firm. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And I'm done being controlled. There was a tense silence in the room, but then Marcus stepped forward. You're right, Jake. You've been played. But you're not the only one. Leah and Samuel have been playing us all. And I've had enough. Jake's eyes widened in disbelief. You knew? You've been working with her? Marcus nodded, his expression grim. I didn't have a choice. But I do now. The truth hit Jake like a ton of bricks. Marcus had known all along, but he had been a part of the game too. The world he thought he was escaping from wasn't as simple as he had imagined. It wasn't just Leah, it was a network, a system of manipulation that stretched far and wide. And Jake had only scratched the surface. Leah's face twisted in anger, realizing the tables had turned. You think you can betray me and get away with it? She spat. Jake's voice was calm, but resolute. This is where it ends, Leah. We're not going to be a part of your game anymore. You'll never have control over us again. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. But then, with one swift motion, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a recording that would expose everything. The message from Leah, the lies, the manipulation, everything was on that recording. Jake held it out, his eyes never leaving hers. It's over. You've lost. Leah's eyes narrowed as she realized the game was up. But there was nothing she could do. The truth had already been set in motion. As the sound of sirens began to echo in the distance, Leah took one last look at Jake before disappearing into the shadows. For the first time in his life, Jake felt the weight of the world lift from his shoulders. The final chapter had been written. He had faced the darkness, fought back, and won. Jake had chosen to break free from the chains of his past and take control of his future. He wasn't just a survivor anymore, he was a victor. And as he walked away from the docks, he knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning.